British government cares about war crimes. In March, they went to war to prevent atrocities in Kosovo.
I will promise a full cooperation of Britain in bringing to justice those who have stained Kosovo with ethnic cleansing and genocide.
Every NATO leader made it clear that war criminals are going to be brought to justice.
They stand at risk, and we should be prepared to use the war crimes legislation to bring them to account.
But despite the concerns over Kosovo, Britain's record on war criminals has not been good. Anthony Savoniuk is the only man ever to be convicted in Britain for Nazi war crimes. But tonight we can reveal that many more Nazi war criminals found refuge in this country. And they were brought here by the British government. In 1947, an entire division of the Nazi SS, some 8,000 men, came to live in Britain. And many of them are still here today.
In just about every reasonable sized town you will find somebody associated or a direct descendant of a member of the Galizien division.
For the first time, we can reveal evidence that the division which came to Britain included men who had committed war crimes. Millions of people lost their lives at the hands of the Nazis during the Second World War. But Ukraine suffered more than most.
Ukraine lost more of its population during the Second World War than any other nation in occupied Europe. Ukraine was entirely occupied during the course of the war. Many of the major battles of the Second World War on the Eastern Front were fought on Ukrainian lands. The country itself was fairly thoroughly devastated.
Despite this devastation and 2 years of Nazi occupation, thousands of Ukrainians, mainly from the west of the country, volunteered to fight for the German cause.
Promowa gubernatora SS Brigady Führera doktora Wächtera.
In April 1943, in Lvov in western Ukraine, the Germans announced that after repeated Ukrainian requests, the Führer had agreed to the formation of a division of Ukrainian volunteers within the Nazi SS. The 14th SS Division, Galizien. Despite Germany's terrible oppression of the country, 80,000 men volunteered to join within the first 2 months. Enough for 2 divisions.
The Germans came with an anti-Soviet message, a message that some Ukrainians found very appealing. People saw this as one option for asserting Ukrainian independence, and they took it.
Many young Ukrainians were drawn to the Waffen-SS for the glamour, the dash of these elite units, and because of all German units, the Waffen-SS had this anti-communist crusading zeal, which also meant that it was a savage fighting force. The German Waffen-SS was a fanatical military unit which had grown up out of the units that had guarded the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. The men were specially selected, they were very heavily indoctrinated, and although that fanatical core was diluted as the war went on, the SS always had a ferocious reputation for ideological commitment and fanaticism.
Like other SS units, the recruits to the Galicia division all swore an oath of absolute allegiance and personal obedience to Adolf Hitler. The Germans appointed officers with specific and singular expertise to the Galicia division. Men like the divisional commander SS General Fritz Freytag, who in 1941 served with an SS unit which killed over 6,000 unarmed civilians in occupied Russia. Men like the commander of the 5th SS Galician Regiment, Franz Lechthaler, who organized the mass execution of over 5,900 Jewish men, women and children in Bielorussia in 1941. Men like the commander of the 4th SS Galician Regiment, Siegfried Binz, an anti-partisan specialist who in one operation alone was involved in the murder of over 10,000 alleged partisans and Jews. And men like SS Colonel Friedrich Daehn, a member of Himmler's personal command staff, a unit estimated to be responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 people. Few, if any, of the foreign SS divisions had so many officers with such experience of mass murder. And all of these German officers served with the Galicia division.
They weren't soldiers, they were primarily policemen, people who had done dirty work for the German regime, ardent Nazis.
Michael Melnick's father was in the Galicia division. He has spent 12 years talking to hundreds of former members to research the division's history.
The Germans wanted to exploit them and use them, and weren't fussy, and for that reason they would have given them jobs they didn't want to do themselves.
Without access to the Soviet archives, it was very difficult to work out exactly what the Ukrainian units had been up to. But things have now changed. The material is coming out of the archives, and this gives us a much deeper knowledge of who the men were who ended up in the division that came to England and what they had been doing before they joined the Ukrainian division.
And some of these men had a long history of serving the Germans. In 1941, as the Germans invaded Western Ukraine, many people welcomed them as liberators from 2 years of Soviet oppression.
Weg mit den Gipskitsch!
The Germans brought with them a specially trained unit of Ukrainian nationalists, the Nightingale Battalion. And as they entered Lvov, they discovered that the departing Soviet secret police had murdered several thousand Ukrainian nationalists and intellectuals in cold blood. Although many of the victims were Jewish, the mob blamed the Jews for the massacre, and a bloody pogrom ensued.
It's a regrettable but true fact that there was a very significant component of the Jewish community in Eastern Galicia, Western Ukraine, that had welcomed the Soviets in 1939 and had actively collaborated with the Soviets during the period of their administration. Some of these people were then targeted for reprisals. There's nothing decent about what happened. But then there's nothing decent about what they did to their fellow neighbors, Poles and Ukrainians, and other Jews alike during the Soviet occupation.
Several thousand Jews were killed over the next few days. Members of the Nightingale Battalion, as well as other Ukrainian units serving the Germans, were implicated in the pogrom in Lvov. This footage was taken by a German amateur cameraman in Lvov that day. It is some of the only filmed footage of a Nazi action against the Jews which has survived the war. After the war, West German courts directly accused members of the 2nd Company of the Nightingale Battalion of involvement in the deaths of the Jews of Lvov. The Nightingale Battalion became an auxiliary police battalion, working for the Germans on anti-partisan duties before joining the Galicia Division in 1943. But were units of the Galicia Division itself involved in war crimes?
By 1944, southern Poland was in a state of near anarchy. There were Polish, Ukrainian resistance movements, Jewish partisan units in the forest. All of these operations relied upon the support of civilian populations, providing the partisans with food and supplies. The civilian population would sometimes voluntarily help partisan units. Sometimes they had no choice. The Germans wanted a reign of terror. Anyone who helped the partisans usually was shot.
By early 1944, the Polish village of Huta Pieniacka had become a refuge for Polish villagers from the surrounding area and for Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. But after reports of partisan activity in the area, members of the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment of the Galicia Division were sent on a reconnaissance patrol to the village. Mieczysław Bernacki used to live in Huta Pieniacka. He was 13 years old at the time.
Some Ukrainian soldiers, about a platoon in strength, came out of the forest to a kind of meadow and started to fire at Huta from small arms and rifles. Then one man in his prime, he was, put his rifle in a fork between the branches of a fruit tree and started to fire at the Ukrainians. And as a result, he killed 2 Ukrainians. And the 2 corpses lay there for 3 or 4 days. And the Jews, whose clothes were in tatters, who had nothing to wear, undressed these Ukrainian soldiers and put their clothes on. And the bodies lay there naked. They were corpses, of course.
They were the division's first casualties of the war. They were given a hero's funeral with full military honors. According to the Galicia Division's own chronicle, the loss was keenly felt. It said, "Now the division starts to write its history in blood." A few days later, the Galician unit went back to Huta Pieniacka.
Then the Germans came with these Ukrainian soldiers and surrounded the village. It was Monday, the 28th of February.
Stefania Jasinska was also in Huta Pieniacka that day.
First they fired because they thought our people would shoot back, but it was quiet, and our people didn't do anything. They entered the village only when they were sure nobody would shoot back. People were crying and screaming. Later, 3 Ukrainians entered the church. One was shooting in the air. They shouted that partisans are kept here.
From one point of view, you could say we were a base for the Russian partisans. But the Russians used us. And when it came to defending the village, they were nowhere to be found.
Then they took groups of people one by one to barns and houses, poured petrol over them and burned them. The screaming and crying was terrible. Old women kissed their hands and feet to be set free.
They killed and burned 850 people. You know, we could not recognize who was who, as they were burned in the barns, the houses and stables. You could only recognize somebody if they weren't burned completely, and only then by their clothes. Because if one corpse stuck to another, the clothes stayed and you could recognize the color. And otherwise only the bones remained.
Father, mother, brother, grandmother, uncle, aunts, cousins. They were all burned and we could not find them. I could only find part of my father's belt and coat. We were taken as the last group to the barn. So one German was in front and 3 Ukrainians were on both sides and at the back. And when they were urging us on, they spoke in Ukrainian. I escaped from this barn because my brother-in-law opened the door, and we escaped to the forest.
My grandmother was taken to such a barn, and there the Germans shot her and burned her, a woman of 85 years. She used to say to me, I would like to survive this war and see what Poland will be like. But she did not live to see it.
News of the massacre soon leaked out. A month later, the Polish underground sent coded messages to London, which specifically implicated the Galicia division in the attack.
Elements of the 4th Regiment were deployed at Utopinetska. They were deployed in the initial attack. They were not ultimately responsible for the pacification of the village. By that time, the responsibility had passed to a following German unit.
So you're saying that they left early and then somebody else came and did it?
Yes, indeed.
No. If it was like that, the people would have realized it and escaped to the forest.
Don't listen to this. They were there until the end.
I've also been told, and from the accounts I have, when the final pacification of that village occurred, the Ukrainian unit had moved on. If somebody tells me otherwise, then all I can do is listen to what's being said and investigate it to the best of my ability.
Members of the 4th Regiment of the Galician Division were later awarded the Iron Cross for their anti-partisan activities in the area. In October 1947, the Polish government made an official complaint to the United Nations about the Galician Division, in particular for their part in the mass murder in Huta Pieniacka. Polish authorities are still investigating those killings on February the 28th, 1944. The lead prosecutor is Bogusława Marcinkowska.
To była okrutna zbrodnia.
It was an evil crime that led to the deaths of over 800 people, according to our estimates, and the people responsible for it should be brought to justice. Our investigation resulted in gathering substantial evidence. Altogether, we have 120 witnesses. The evidence we obtained in our investigation explicitly points to one of the sub-units of the 14th SS Division Galizien. We have no doubt at all. It was that division, and our witnesses so testify.
We understand that members of the 4th Regiment of the Galicia Division, which was involved at Huta Pieniacka, came to live in the West after the war.
Some of the Ukrainian participants in the initial attacks
Yes.
are in Britain, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
In May 1944, the division was inspected by the leader of the SS himself, Heinrich Himmler. He, at least, was in no doubt about their attitude towards the Poles.
I know if I gave the division the order to exterminate the Poles in this area or that, then I would become a very popular man amongst you.
In the summer of 1944, the Galician division was sent to the Eastern Front. To face the Red Army, massing near the Ukrainian city of Brody. It was their first experience of full-scale combat. And it was a disaster. After nearly 2 weeks of heavy fighting, the division was decimated. Of 11,000 men who went into battle, only 3,000 returned.
After July of 1944, the division was slowly regrouped, and there was an effort to conscript people into the division, which included releasing people from Nazi concentration camps on the promise that they would serve in the division. And then there were people who were inducted into the division from various existing battalions and regiments and units that had been attached to other German forces. Men do strange things in war, and sometimes men do very horrible things. And they should be judged by what they did.
In August 1944, in the fascist puppet state of Slovakia, a popular rebellion broke out to gain independence for the country from Nazi Germany. German intelligence acknowledged that the uprising was truly popular and said that only a fool would seek to stop it by military means. But a week later, the Germans sent in over 40,000 troops, including 2 SS divisions, to crush the rebellion.
The Slovakian uprising was a savage, bloody conflict. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. No mercy was shown on either side. If Ukrainian units were involved in suppressing the Slovak national uprising, it is almost inevitable that they were engaged in brutal, merciless, anti-partisan warfare.
At the time of the so-called Slovak uprising, the relations between members of the division and the Slovak population in general were considered to be good.
The division was, of course, definitely unpopular. I think there would have been all sorts of people within the ranks of the 14th SS Division Galizien. Some of them were really only on guard duties, but they couldn't know what the other parts of the division were delegated to do. And the other units did take part in reprisals against civilians and the members of the uprising.
In Slovakia, the division suffered from severe discipline problems. One senior SS intelligence officer later testified, "The Ukrainian units of the Waffen-SS were very unreliable, often deserted, didn't want to fight and just plundered."
Burning, murdering, terror and reprisals. This was their craft, basically. But I have to say that we can also find exceptions among them, as is the case everywhere and in every army. But the exceptions rather prove the rule. In Smrečany, the Wittenmeyer unit from the division burnt down the village using artillery and mortar fire. The civilian population was driven out of the village, and 80% of the 120 houses burnt down. It has to be said that Smrečany was a supply outpost for the partisan movement. This is the reason why the reprisal was aimed against it, and it was in fact a cruel punishment for helping the partisan movement.
But very often the civilians didn't have any choice.
One day one lot would come and knock on the window, and another day another lot would come and knock on the window. They either asked for food or bread, well, anything, or some bacon, or I don't know.
At the end of October 1944, the Wittenmeyer unit of the 14th SS Division Galizien entered the village of Nizhna Bocha.
They stormed into the pub first and just drank there. And then they did whatever they wanted. The men who were there said that the soldiers who were interrogating them were drunk. It was obvious that they were not all right. And they banged on the doors very hard. And then my grandfather went up and they went straight to him because he was an older man. And they say, "Well, where are the partisans?" And he said that we had no partisans here.
No tak, robili tu domową prehliadku, tak oni...
They were doing house searches, and whoever they found in the houses, they were summoned to go to the school.
But then in the evening they rounded up all the men into the school, straight away that evening.
The soldiers interrogated 5 people. Cyril Zahradnik was arrested solely for having a Russian coin in his pocket. He was 15 years old.
Those that were sentenced, they were kicked and beaten, and they were kept there till morning.
Keď skončili to, tak odsúdili ich na smrť.
When they finished the questioning, they sentenced them to death, these men, and they just shot them.
Zahradnik,
he was just a boy.
He called out for his mother. Apparently in school he cried, "My dear mummy, you won't see me anymore."
Such a desperate cry.
What did the child do to anyone? He wasn't even a soldier. How the child wept and cried. He was led from the school, led to the bridge. And from the bridge they were shot, so they fell in the water. They had no mercy.
It was horrible. It was a horrible feeling. You can never forget it.
Captured German documents confirm that the Wittenmeyer unit of the 14th SS Division Galizien entered the village of Nizhna Bocha that day. The documents say, the Ukrainian volunteers of the 14th SS Division engaged in the battle fought excellently.
They didn't find any partisans in the end, and our men had to pay for it.
The Slovak uprising was recognized and aided by all of the Allies fighting Hitler. Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union all sent military missions and essential military supplies to aid the rebels. And Allied aircrew who had crash-landed or who had been shot down over Nazi-occupied Europe were airlifted out of the country. But like the partisans, the downed Allied airmen were also hunted by the German forces, including the Galicia Division.
I have had testimony of a number of veterans who encountered Allied flyers during the operations. Allied flyers were captured by the division, or by divisional personnel. They were taken prisoner, they weren't maltreated by the Ukrainians, and they were passed to the military police unit attached to the division. Whether they were shot or not, I don't know.
I think it would be a mistake to make a blanket accusation against every man in the Galician division. I think many of those who entered its ranks when it was first raised were anti-Russian, anti-Bolshevik idealists. But as the division lost men in combat, replacements came from very different sources. Ukrainian collaborationist police units, guard units that had been guarding ghettos, labor camps. The Ukrainian division, by the end of the war, had become a rallying ground for all sorts of Ukrainian nationalists, fanatical pro-Nazis, as well as honest anti-Soviet fighters.
One of the collaborationist units which later joined the Galicia Division was the Ukrainian Self-Defense Legion. In 1968, Polish prosecutors began an investigation into the Ukrainian Self-Defense Legion and into one of its leading members, Theodor Duck. Duck was eventually sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for his activities with the Legion during the war.
I started an investigation to see what Duck had actually done. I proved beyond doubt that he had committed murders. He had murdered about 25 people or thereabouts. He murdered Ukrainians, he murdered Poles, he murdered his own acquaintances.
The Ukrainian Self-Defense Legion was recruited from Ukrainian nationalist partisans by members of the notorious SS murder squads, the Einsatzgruppen. In the summer of 1944, the unit was crossing the Lublin region of southern Poland when their commander, SS Captain Siegfried Asmus, was shot and killed.
As a result, after a short while, Asmas's deputy, Colonel Chichenko, decided to pacify the village of Klaniov.
One former member of the unit, Vasil Malashinsky, gave evidence to a post-war trial about the attack on the village.
It was like a kind of ecstasy. We burned, we shot, and we destroyed. I was shooting, and perhaps I set fire to things. I don't remember if I shot anybody. We didn't go into houses because they were already burning. I saw the bodies of men, women, and children. We didn't leave anybody alive.
"44 civilians, mainly old people and children, fell victim to the Legion in Klaniov that day. Some were just 3 years old. After the murders in Klaniov, Dak's unit went on to kill another 105 people in the village of Skaldmierz.
Partisan warfare by its very nature means that civilians can find themselves in an active role, as the Americans found out to their great cost in Vietnam.
But they can also be innocent bystanders.
They can be innocent bystanders. Who's to say which they are in the heat of the moment?
Are there people from the Self-Defense Legion still in Britain today?
Yes. There are people from the Self-Defense Legion living in Britain today.
It is beyond dispute that it was involved in the pacification of Klaniov. It is beyond dispute that it was involved in the pacification of Skaldmierz. And it is in no doubt whatsoever that the Ukrainian Self-Defense Legion took part in suppressing the Warsaw Uprising. This is obvious, beyond any dispute.
Leichte Flak beschießt ein Beobachtungsnest auf einem Turm.
It was a ferocious, merciless conflict. Warsaw was pretty much razed to the ground. It was one of the most barbaric moments of the Second World War. Surviving members of the division who came to Britain, who settled here, always strenuously denied that any of the members of the unit had had any involvement in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. If there is evidence of that, it completely shatters the story that they have perpetuated.
This unit roster of the Ukrainian Self-Defense Legion confirms that they saw action fighting for the Germans in Warsaw. 3 months later, Theodor Dak and the Self-Defense Legion joined the SS Division Galizien. In 1945, they surrendered to the British Army in Austria. In the last days of the war, the British Army was pushing into Austria, where they discovered thousands of Ukrainians in German military uniforms.
We had the shambles of various nationalities. We were tired. We wanted to get rid of the buggers, you see, and go home.
In 1945, Dennis Hills was a major in the British Army.
The job of the army was to clear the place, get rid of the rubbish.
They simply gave these men marching orders. They said, head southwards towards Italy and someone will take care of you when you arrive. And that's exactly what the division did. They just trundled off south towards Italy.
Ukrainians were put into a camp at Rimini. There were escapes. In fact, the guarding was very poor in those days. The SS used to run away, and it was slack.
Under the agreement reached with the Soviet Union at Yalta, the British were committed to sending back all Soviet citizens captured in German army uniform or who had served the Third Reich in any capacity.
But the problem was in determining precisely where the men came from. If they were from eastern Ukraine, which before the war had been under Soviet rule, they were liable to be deported. But if they came from western Ukraine, which before the war had been under Polish rule, they were not liable to be sent back.
My job was to find out more or less who the hell they were. I found a lot came from Soviet Ukraine. When I made my report, I made it clear that these fellows should be given the benefit of the doubt. They should not be repatriated.
In the summer of 1945, the Red Army sent a screening team to Rimini.
I remember 4 or 5 officers had an interpreter screening soldiers who refused to participate. They were there to check on the Ukrainians and to try to persuade us so that they be sent back to Russia. They couldn't even get into conversation with these fellows. They were simply dumb insolents, you know. The question of war criminals did arise, and the Soviet military mission did give us a few names. And these names were handed in to one of our captains, and I think he looked at them and threw them in a waste paper basket. Propaganda. You can't believe all this rotten nonsense.
But 2 years later, the British decided to check for themselves if there were war criminals in the camp. They sent a screening mission led by Brigadier Fitzroy MacLean.
It became quite clear to me that this was a hopeless proposition. We were not qualified to screen Ukrainians. We didn't have the necessary language experts or anything like that.
It was very difficult for MacLean, in the absence of any personal documentation, army paybooks, etc., to work out just who these men were, where they'd come from, what units they'd served with. He basically had to accept whatever it was that they told him.
The Ukrainians told MacLean that the division had only been formed in September 1944 and had been occupied with training and guard duties. They told him that they did not commit a single crime during the entire war.
He made it quite clear to Whitehall that his report was not watertight and he had suspicions about them.
I think it was fairly clear that quite a number of them must have been in the SS as part of a Ukrainian SS division. So there was every probability that there were war criminals amongst them.
MacLean was very honest. He said he didn't have the time or the resources to do a thorough screening and he thought they should be screened later on, which meant being screened in England.
Did that happen?
No.
In London, civil servants were divided. Eventually it was the Prime Minister Clement Attlee who decided to let all 8,000 men of the Ukrainian SS division into Britain.
It was unprecedented for such a large number of men to be brought into the United Kingdom without going through any of the normal channels. The news leaked out that a division of Ukrainian soldiers who fought for the Germans was arriving in England. Questions were asked in Parliament that men who'd been involved in war crimes were now being housed in camps in Britain without apparently having been very carefully screened.
The minister, Hector MacNeill, told Parliament that the Ukrainians had been screened twice before and that no war criminals had been found.
Hector MacNeill was either being deliberately economical with the truth or, in unparliamentary language, lying, or else he had been fooled by the Ukrainians. In either case, what we now know about the division's history suggests that his reply is worthless.
The Home Office has confirmed that Hector McNeill's answer is still official government policy today.
It is quite wrong to insist on the kind of reports that were created immediately after the war in those chaotic conditions as still being valid.
The historical record does not reveal precisely why the British Prime Minister was so generous to the Ukrainian division. There is some evidence that other agencies had an interest in their arrival.
The period from the division surrender until the division was eventually brought back to England is extremely murky. I know for a fact from the people that I have spoken to, a number were trained by Western intelligence agencies, be them American or British, for clandestine operations to take place behind Soviet lines in the immediate post-war period.
And these people had been former members of the Galicia division?
Yes, indeed they had. That was the basis for them being selected. No question about that whatsoever.
By the time the Ukrainians arrived in the United Kingdom, the British government was fed up with trying war criminals. They had no appetite for further war crimes investigations or war crimes trials.
No member of the Galicia division has ever been tried for war crimes in Great Britain. And we could find no evidence that any member has even been investigated for crimes committed in the service of the Nazis. Government records which could help expose the guilty men have never been made public.
1,500 former members of the Galician division live in this country today. It would be naive and unfair to suggest that everybody within the Galician division was a war criminal. But by the same token, a small element undoubtedly were. They should be pursued and punished, and the rest should be left in peace.
These military formations are presented as those that fought for the liberation of Ukraine. It did not serve Ukraine. It served the Germans. It was not fighting with an armed opponent. It was fighting against civilians, against the civilian population, against defenseless people.
There should be a reopening of the question of the Ukrainian division. Who these men were, how they got here. Why were they not investigated years ago when the evidence and the witnesses were available?
Why destroy a man's life? Why be a shit and punish people?
We are under a moral obligation to bring to justice those who were responsible for an evil crime, even if it was committed over 50 years ago.
You know, if it was 1945, I would order them to be cut and salted. Today, maybe, I would forgive them. But I will never forget this. Never.
Let God judge them according to their own conscience. They should come to terms with themselves for what they have done.